0.01 Bitcoin is an absurdly small amount. And this should be all it takes to retire? Very hard to believe. Even with a 4-year plan, with a 5, 6, 7, 10-year plan, it's very hard to imagine that such a small US dollar amount can buy so much freedom in a Bitcoin future. And when Brandon mentioned the 0.01 Bitcoin number, naturally I'm very critical, but his math checks 100% out. And we also talk about strategy, stretch, and a new retirement plan within that system. How he looks at MSDR, how he looks also at the current government, and he sees in 90 days something very interesting happening in the US politics, which will massively impact Bitcoin. This 1 hour with Brandon was extremely packed. Enjoy. Topic that I think you talk a lot about, which is very popular also with people, is the whole Bitcoin retirement topic. And I think we talked actually last time also a little bit about that, or a lot. I don't remember exactly, but I want to get your take on it, especially now that we have strategy, stretch, and all those new tools in the market. How is Bitcoin retirement now changing with MSTR, with SDRC, and all those products?
Yeah, I mean, I think it just allows you to kind of diversify, right? I mean, at the end of the day, with retirement, one thing that you have to worry about is the volatility of Bitcoin. Bitcoin is a very volatile asset. So, I mean, let's face it, a lot of Americans or Europeans who are looking to retire, being 100% in Bitcoin, if you were at $120,000, what, 6 months, 7 months ago now at this point in October, or maybe I'm getting the months wrong, maybe 8 or 9 or 10 months ago, you saw basically your entire net worth get cut in half, right? So you need to wait and try to not sell Bitcoin during the bear markets, right? You need to try to level yourself out. So I think, these things, like I said, as like a business owner or somebody who's looking to retire on Bitcoin, you can have a significantly less amount of Bitcoin. And if you have some of these, aspects of your portfolio, like a stretch, or even if you just had some bonds or something like that, I mean, I truly believe that you need to have some sort of Bitcoin in order to retire, right? Because I've heard stories of people shutting off bank accounts, maybe the dividends aren't paid out, something like that, right? I mean, you might need some cash that you can be able to get and use at any point in time. And Bitcoin is a truly only decentralized, truly secure asset or thing that you can hold, right? I mean, whether it's rental properties or anything like that, even globally, you have to watch out for, all of these different geopolitical things. I mean, the list goes on and on of the benefits of Bitcoin, but, you can geo arbitrage with Bitcoin very easily. You can stack a bunch easily as well. And I mean, let's face it, right? When you have 21 million Bitcoin, the average person, if we were divided by 8 million people or 8 billion people, you only get about 200 to 250,000 sats, which is, less than, a couple $100 now at this point. So just to get to that 1 million sat mark, I think that is, a huge milestone. I'm giving a talk on Prague as to why I think the new millionaire status is actually going to be 1 million sats, strictly because of how many people have Bitcoin on their balance sheet or a personal balance sheet, how many people have 1 million or more sats in their wallets just in cold storage. And if you look at the numbers, I mean, there's 62 million plus millionaires. By the time we finish this podcast, there will probably be close to about 100 new millionaires made by the time you watch this entire thing. And so what are these guys doing? They're simply just sitting on their hands. They have their businesses. Nothing is really changing except that the dollar that you're sitting on is deflating away. And so what is the easiest thing to get into right now with the lowest cost of capital that has the highest amount of asymmetric upside? It's Bitcoin, bar none. It's not even close to anything else. So you can retire on a simple just million sats here, I think, in the next 5 to 10 years. If you change your lifestyle a little bit and you just rush to get into that. A good friend of mine, Trey Sellers, he talks about this 4-year sprint. If you just buckle down and you get into this 4-year cycle and you eliminate some of the overhead expenses, you just buy as much Bitcoin as possible, you'll be able to do that. And then, once after this 4 years, you can give yourself somewhat of a raise. And, there's a lot of communities that go out and look at how much you need to actually retire. And I think when you look at the amount of upside that Bitcoin has, it changes the rate that you need in order to retire, right? I mean, there's the classic 4% rule that the financial independent retire early community uses. You could change that to maybe an 8 or a 10% rule of just all of your annual expenses, and then multiply that by, instead of 25, by 12 and a half or 10. And that just drops down significantly the amount that you need in order to retire. So then you can enjoy yourself on the beach with your family, spend times with your kids. I mean, it just changes the entire outlook. And all you got to do is just buckle down for a few years and save in Bitcoin. And I think that asymmetric upside, you'll be very pleased over the long period of time. So, I truly believe that the small amount, the million sats, the 0.01 Bitcoin, I scream that at nauseum for me and my friends, people around our age, because I think, just that number, everybody thinks you need to get to one Bitcoin, and, 75,000 is way too much. But the average person in the United States, between, I believe it's like 35 and 45, has about 200,000 or 250,000 in their retirement accounts. So I mean, that's just, less than a third of that, 25% of that. If you just put that into Bitcoin, you'll be sitting pretty, to say the very least.
I love that. I'll add one more question in there, because you say like a low amount, like C1 Bitcoin. How many strategy shares do you need to retire on?
It's a good question. I mean, strategy, I think that is, more of a levered bet on Bitcoin. So it's whatever you can stomach on that. I am kind of more intrigued on having something like Stretch in your portfolio, just because, you can have, the monthly dividends coming in to pay expenses, right? So then if you want to go on a more of a lavish vacation or something like that, maybe, your kid gets into college and you want to pay for their tuition, that's when you can maybe use something like Bitcoin. And, there's all these tools right now where you could borrow against your Bitcoin to pay for these tuitions. And if your Stretch shares pay for those monthly payments, then you're basically just, paying for your child's tuition or whatever it is, a wedding, lavish vacation, all of these things just through your investments. So I think, just getting to that first 100,000 in saving, just overall, it doesn't even have to be all Bitcoin. Once you get through that, I mean, the math drastically changes, because even 10% on 100,000, that's 10,000 a year. That's pretty close to covering, some people's expenses over time. Of course, maybe it's not covering everything if you're in, some of the Western nations, but it's not too far off. And then, of course, once you get that 10% and it just keeps on compounding, I think that's the big number to really try to get, is past that 100,000 mark. And then, you can retire on Bitcoin for a low amount and just have that as like a safety net as well. And so I think, whatever Stretch you need to pay some of that. I mean, I know it sounds like a lot, but I mean, you get $1 million worth of Stretch, you're basically getting a 10 grand payment every single month. And, that's not too shabby, to say the very least, right? I mean, and most people who retire in the United States, right, they say you need like $3 to $5 million to retire right now. So that number just becomes a little bit more realistic when you look at just the actual retirement numbers. And then you have some Bitcoin on the side, and you can let time do its thing. You can let Bitcoin ride the wave, right? You don't have to worry about the day-to-day price quite as much. And you can have a small percentage of that Bitcoin over time, and that will just absolutely skyrocket your net worth. And, there's a lot of these products like we were talking about with between MSTR and Stretch and Strive, and now SATA, even with a daily dividend, if they're able to keep that up. I mean, all of these products are very interesting, I think, when it comes to helping yourself retire and then ride the volatility of Bitcoin over time.
It's really interesting because I just looked it up. I never looked it up. Average person in the USA, a single person, spends around $3,000 per month, and an average household spends around $6,500 per month which is huge. Like I did not know that the Americans spend so much. I think the number is different in Europe. I don't know. Maybe I'm just very frugally living. I'm not at that numbers at all. But I'm also don't have a family and stuff. But that's like if you think about that, so you need around 300,000 to 600,000 in stretch. Then we are very far away from the $1 million mark. And maybe you have some other, like you could literally have like 500K in stretch and 500K in Bitcoin, maybe some in leverage play in strategy. You all of a sudden have a portfolio where most of your expenses are covered directly by stretch. And then on the other hand, you have two growth engines with Bitcoin and strategy. Like that's why I'm kind of bullish on strategy a lot. I'm getting there. People be patient with me. I'm trying slowly to get my foot in the door in the strategy world. But I'm really getting very bullish when I see the portfolio things that you can do with it. So you don't only have to get like Bitcoin and like that's it, but you can do with stretch, with income product strategy, maybe a little bit of a growth product that also is in the TradFi world more credible, and so you get cheaper loan rates against that and can borrow against that in a better way than borrow against your Bitcoin, because the loan rates are still not that good with Bitcoin, even though they get better. So like there are a lot of interesting things that you can do on a personal finance standpoint with all those tools.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, the one thing that I will caution you on, Robin, I don't know if noticed it or saw this too much. Last year, Jamie Dimon and JP Morgan actually had a little bit of an attack on MSTR, where, essentially a lot of the people who held Bitcoin or MSTR, excuse me, through JP Morgan Chase as like, their financial arm, right? They changed their loan to value from like 50% to like 95%, which means basically you need to have, if you want to get $100,000 worth of MSTR or of a loan against your MSTR, you needed 95,000 of that. And that is very rare to have as an asset. Usually it's 50% or lower. And then you saw a big dump off from a lot of the JP Morgan Chase clients because they were like, well, I'm not going to be able to borrow against it. So I need to sell and get into something that I can do that. So there has been some attacks on MSTR with that. And, to be honest with you, I don't know how it's going to turn out with Stretch, if you're going to be able to borrow against that for certain institutions. But there has been little bumps in the road with that. So I will be cautious with some people because, you saw JP Morgan do that. You saw the amount of strategies shares on JP Morgan's balance sheet fall down off a cliff, and then subsequently you saw a lot of volatility in the MSTR stock. So I think, when you look at that, obviously that's where the diversification kind of helps you out a little bit. I know, the Bitcoin community and the maxis here think, getting up to 100% Bitcoin is the way to go. And I think long term, if you have a long enough time horizon, sure, that works out. But obviously, like I just lined out here, if you see your net worth go from 120 to 60,000, and you were kind of thinking, all right, maybe at that time we're going to get to 250,000 or even higher, because I think a lot of the people listening were a little disappointed in the latest bull market. I think, over time that just helps you weather the storm in the short term, because I think all of us here listening and me and you here talking believe in Bitcoin long term. But it just, like you said, it allows you to get some of that growth engine of Bitcoin, but not have to worry about having to sell off. Right. I mean, we saw a lot of these Bitcoin whales sell off within this past like 10 months or so. And, if they had some exposure, maybe they bought into some of this exposure of STRC and MSTR and things like that in order to retire and just get away from the volatility of Bitcoin, at least in the short term. Obviously, like I said, the long term it's going to win, but you got to weather some of those storms. So having the ability to use some of these traditional financial products, I think is part of the genius that Saylor has lined out through these past 2 to 3 years of all these preferred products. And now you have the ability to do that yourself as an individual, which, years ago we didn't really have.
Yeah, it's a good point, because like we now just have way more tools in our at our disposal. So like I want to caution that, because like I'm almost at 100% Bitcoin allocation. I have some cash, I have some small MSTR position, and I'm tinkering around with ESST and SDSC. But like most of my portfolio is just like Bitcoin, little MSTR, little bit cash, little bit that and that. But it's nice to have optionality. That's why I also say, if you are a Bitcoiner, you probably should have some cash laying around. And now in the bear market, we all know why. Because you can buy the dip and a lot faster progression. I like the Stephen Perrinot brought it on my podcast, that concept of having 75% in Bitcoin and 25% in cash. And he was not even talking about stretch at that point. He was just talking about the cash. And he modeled it out. You actually end up with more Bitcoin, because if Bitcoin is ripping up, in his model, he's selling some Bitcoin. I would not do that. But with his model, if Bitcoin is ripping up, you sell some Bitcoin to get more cash. And then if Bitcoin goes down, you acquire Bitcoin with the cash that you have. And because Bitcoin is so volatile, you just end up with more Bitcoin than you start with. Now, I do not sell my Bitcoin, and I don't like that strategy. But it is an interesting strategy when you think about just the cash side of it. So if the cash, like if your Bitcoin position grows so much that you put a little bit more cash into the cash position and don't buy as aggressively, and if it falls aggressively, you have to buy more Bitcoin to keep it at like the 75%. So it's an interesting strategy, I think, like with the dips and the volatility.
Yeah, and I mean, I think, over time, right? I mean, let's just face it, we're still in a fiat denominated world. I mean, you can live in Bitcoin in certain areas, but you're going to need cash at the end of the day to live in most countries. I mean, it's just the reality of the world that we're in right now. But I do think that, like we said, over time, Bitcoin is going to, I think, go through this 50-year cycle. I've talked to Mark Moss a little bit about this, and he's basically lined it out. The first 10 years is institutional adoption, or retail adoption, which we basically saw between 2010 and 2020. Then the second 10 years, 2020 to 2030, that's when we're going to see a lot of the institutions. 2030 to 40, that's where I think a lot more governments. I mean, obviously we've seen El Salvador, Kingdom of Bhutan. Maybe there's some countries quietly stacking Bitcoin that we don't know about. I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, the United States just seized some of Iran's crypto. Who knows how much of that has been Bitcoin? And, that could be a geopolitical play that we start to see in the 2030s to 2040s. And then, I think 2040 to 2050, that's when we'll start to see people really start to understand and maybe get towards the medium of exchange. And then 2050 to 60, that's where we'll probably see it become more of a unit of account, where instead of dollars, euros, wherever country you're at, it'll be denominated in sats. So we're still a little ways away from that, right? So, like you said, if you want to retire now and avoid a lot of that volatility, getting some cash position in your stack maybe will be useful. Keeping some cash on the sidelines will be useful. I mean, let's face it, right? Like I said, you need some of those daily expenses. That's why I like the STRC aspect of it, because, if you have some of that, you will get that monthly income coming in. And that's when you can let your assets basically do the work for you, and you can start to live off of that, opposed to, having to sell your Bitcoin in order to pay rent, or having to sell your Bitcoin in order to go on a vacation or something like that.
Love that. Really, really cool. I want to actually talk with you about strategy. What's your read on the stock? What's your read on like what they're currently doing?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, what Michael Saylor's doing is incredible. I mean, he's essentially leveraging all of the current system in order to go into the new system, right? So he's using the entire fiat Wall Street arm, where he's been able to accumulate just a ton of capital. Honestly, more than any of us could. I mean, me and you, Robin, could probably try to pull out as many zero interest credit cards as we possibly could to try to buy as much Bitcoin. But the scale of what we would be able to do just personally wouldn't be at the level that MicroStrategy and Michael Saylor is doing. I mean, essentially, he's, pulling 4 levers with stretch, strive, and these other two that are all kind of going through and just feeding this Bitcoin machine. So it is kind of interesting. We're recording and talking about this on the day that Strategy sold 32 Bitcoin, right? I mean, it's the market's dumping now, probably on that news because the market likes to react. But I mean, Saylor has bought 40,000 Bitcoin the past couple of weeks. We've seen Stretch be just this product that's incredible, and there's so much demand for it. But essentially, Saylor is using the traditional financial system to pull into a lot of these just giant markets. I mean, they're $1 trillion markets that he's just going to tap into. And if he's able to just get a few percentage points, like 1 or 2%, that's doubling Bitcoin's market cap just by strategy alone. And so they're essentially just a one-man machine or one company machine right now, buying up as much Bitcoin that's being mined every single day. So it's truly incredible. But essentially, the biggest driver of all of this is just Stretch. I mean, it's a preferred perpetual stock that essentially, he's paying anywhere from 10 to 13% on the month. And they're keeping it right around $100. So it's relatively flat. And, I think a lot of businesses are looking at this as more of like a money market fund. There's been a lot of talk back and forth on it, whether or not it's marketed properly. I mean, we had CoffeeZilla go on with punter Jeff or Jeff Walton here recently and kind of argued the semantics about it. But I think the funny thing about all of that and what CoffeeZilla really dove into is that he just didn't like the marketing perspective of it, right? He couldn't find somebody that's a professional for exposing scams could not find a hole in this, except for his thought was, Bitcoin couldn't just be, I think it was like 25 or $30 million in 50 years, which, I mean, if you get to just an extremely low CAGR, I think it's like less than 10%, then, strategy is going to be all right on paying out those dividends. But I think the biggest thing that people are missing with all of this is that, strategy is getting a lot of preferred equity or offering this preferred equity. So a lot of people are just dumping in money, and he's able to use that money and pull it into Bitcoin. But, they've recently bought bonds. They've recently raised capital as well. So the dividends that they would be able to pay out essentially are at least 3 years, and Bitcoin would have to crash to like under $10,000 and be there for a long period of time in order to do that. So strategy has essentially created this infinite money glitch where they're just able to accumulate massive amounts of Bitcoin. And, we all know when you put the infinity over the 21 million, I mean, you're just going to be able to keep accumulating and getting into that. And then eventually, when we hit that supply shock, I wouldn't be surprised if strategy is the most profitable, most powerful company in the world. And, we see the demand on the market for all these different products. So I think the financial institutions really woke up to what strategy was doing last year in 2025. The problem was just the timing for all of them, Robin. I mean, we saw, I think it was over 200 at the peak of these, traditional publicly traded companies that put Bitcoin on the balance sheet. And, strategy now has had to sell Bitcoin twice in their entire existence, where a lot of them just kind of came in and bought one time and then haven't really announced another buy. But I think that there might be some more institutional buys coming in later, and maybe we can get into why I believe that here later on in this show. But if you want to dive into anything else related to strategy, I'm happy to do that, because I think what they're building is just truly incredible. And what Michael Saylor is able to do is something that I don't think will ever be replicated again.
No matter if you already have self-custody or still have your Bitcoin on exchange, your generational wealth that you have in Bitcoin could be completely at risk. And that's why I highly recommend to you to give the Bitcoin Way a 30-minute free consultation call to check how secure your custody setup really is and what you can still improve. So head over to thebitcoinway.com/Robin. Again, that's the bitcoinway.com/Robin and get your free initial 30-minute call with the Bitcoin Way. I think so too. I mean, on that point, like Strive is trying it. Like
Yeah.
ASSD is trying it. And they have to pay a bigger hurdle rate. They have to pay the 13%. And they're now moving to daily. Let's see how well they can keep it at par. So there's a lot of like moving parts there. But do you think that Strive, or like any other company for that matter, could actually have some, like, be real competition to Strategy? Because currently you can't really name them as a competition.
Yeah, there's differences, right? I mean, I think the second biggest Bitcoin holder of any company has like 50 or 60,000 Bitcoin on their balance sheet, right? I mean, there's a huge difference between 50,000 Bitcoin and 800,000 Bitcoin. So, I mean, you think it's like, excuse me, orders of magnitude greater now. And so, as far as competition goes, I think there's going to be a lot that might pop up after this. Obviously, we've seen, like, I think, three of the biggest 10 IPOs in the past like decade have been all from Strives or MSTRs, like preferred equities and preferred offerings. And they're just absolutely massive. So I don't think that there's going to be necessarily like a big competitor. I mean, of course, like I've kind of had the theory that, Mark Zuckerberg, he could be the only one that could really do that just because of how much ownership he has of Meta. But, they have a huge technology company, right? They're going all in on AI. And I think that's kind of the recent trend. And Bitcoin has kind of lulled some people to sleep. So I think, once we start hitting this, supply shock and we start to go really parabolic and vertical, that's when we'll start to see more people come in. When in reality, as you and I know, the bear markets are for building these type of products and really just, widening the moat and being able to level a lot of the volatility. So right now, as it stands, like I couldn't see anybody really challenging him. I mean, maybe, with Tether and, Jack Mallers, their ability to raise capital, maybe they'd be able to do that. But, that would have to take Tether donating a lot of Bitcoin or moving some of the Tether Bitcoin over to 21. And I don't think that, a lot of these companies, how they started was they don't really have a profitable business underneath. Strategy has had the software business. Of course, they've kind of pivoted a little bit away from that, but they had the profitable, just steady business for a while. And that's why they were able to do this. They could raise massive amounts of debt and continually just pay that over time. And now the Bitcoin balance on their balance sheet has just gotten so big and they're able to raise so much capital that's how they're able to finance the debt. But a lot of these companies, we saw it with Naka, they're going to have to buy something like a Bitcoin magazine or some type of company like that in order to pay that debt, at least initially, because, when you don't have a lot of Bitcoin on the balance sheet, it's going to be difficult to pay that debt over time without selling. And then if you sell that Bitcoin, you're going to see a massive dip in the stock price. And that's kind of what we're seeing right now with Strategy when, like we said, at the beginning, they only sold 32 Bitcoin, but everybody's rising up in flames and freaking out about, this sale of 32 just because, of how Saylor's essentially marketed himself in Strategy over time of like never sell Bitcoin and all of these different tactics. But the mechanics behind what Strategy is building, I don't think can be replicated simply because of the massive amount of moat that they have, where, they're going to get to 1 million Bitcoin. I would put my money on it, that they're going to get to 1 million Bitcoin by the end of the year, even with this road bump, let's call it, of selling 32 coins in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah, they had weeks where they raised 30,000 Bitcoin, 40,000 Bitcoin. I think like around 30 to 40,000 was the biggest week they had this year so far. So selling 32 Bitcoin, I mean that the math is kind of looking really nice, because if they can raise 10 Bitcoin, they can sell one to cover the dividends and they gain 9 Bitcoin. That's how I kind of look at it. Like, they have to sell Bitcoin at some point. And they did it already before, I think in 2022 at like 20 Bitcoin or so for some tax purposes. And I think this is also tax purpose long term, because they can sell some high cost 126K Bitcoin at like 70K and have the put the tax loss on the balance sheet and basically get free Bitcoin in the long run. So they should use the balance sheet. They should do those things. And I'm still in my learning process. I'm gaining more and more confidence in the strategy stock. I'm gaining more and more exposure on the common shares also, and so I'm quite bullish on them, but I'm still learning. Like I don't want to come out too bullish or too bearish yet, because I'm still learning. There's so much, like, strategy is a complex thing, but potentially like a huge engine for your own portfolio.
Yeah, and I mean, just personally, I think a lot of people who hold Bitcoin on the balance sheet have gotten into a little bit of trouble here lately. I mean, we're seeing it in a lot of these institutions already, right? I mean, Nakamoto's one, and a few others that essentially bought the top and saw it all crash. I mean, for me as a small business owner, I mean, something like Stretch is actually pretty advantageous because you could get 10 to 13% paid out monthly, dividends on there, and it stays relatively flat. Maybe you go down by $1 or $2 or up $1 or $2 on each share, but they've been able to keep that relatively flat. So I think from like a business owner's perspective, or like I said, the people that are looking for more of the money market funds, why would you go into government bonds that we know are just like 4% at this point, and then you're going to be losing because we all know inflation's running hot around 7%. So you're just guaranteeing you're going to lose 3%. Of course, that's a little bit better than losing the, close to 7% if you just had it sitting in a bank account. So I think more people are going to be looking at this. And I mean, I know, Strive is actually putting some Stretch on their balance sheet as well as Bitcoin, just because they're like, hey, we'll buy into this big giant engine. So I wouldn't be surprised if we actually see some more companies looking at that as well, because, once it becomes more of a proven thing, and I think more of these institutions get a little bit more comfortable with Stretches out for a longer period of time, that's where we're going to see a lot of the money coming in. And, I think at the end of the day, right, I mean, Stretch strategy, all the things that they're doing is relatively new. Bitcoin is still relatively new, right? I mean, Bitcoin is not even legal to drink in most countries at this point, right? I mean, some countries it's not even legal to drive. So I think, everybody is getting just lulled to death and think that they missed the boat on Bitcoin, missed the boat on strategy. I think we're just getting started, Robin. I think we're still extremely early, and I think when you look at the numbers for everything, right? I mean, I just can't see how long term you can be bearish. I mean, sure, maybe in the short term we're going to see some volatility, but we see volatility with everything, right? I mean, if you compare it to a certain tech stock, maybe this tech stock and this AI boom has beaten Bitcoin or beaten strategy. But at the end of the day, when you hold this for a long period of time, there's very few things that you're going to beat on Bitcoin. And I think it's one of the safest investments you could make. Obviously, not financial advice or anything like that. But I think, when you just look at the numbers, the fixed supply, you don't have to worry about any CEO risk or anything like that. Bitcoin's the way, right? And Saylor has learned that. And I think Saylor might be running into a little bit of his own conviction early on troubles here by just saying he would never sell or anything like that. And then now people are kind of, like I said, going at him a little bit just for selling these 32. But when you look at the numbers, right, I mean, like we said, they bought 30,000 Bitcoin multiple times in a week this past or during this year, and they sold 32. And that's the headline, right? That's the big thing where everybody's like, what the hell is going on? Why is Saylor selling this amount? But when you look at the percentages, right? I mean, it's like what, 0.01% of what they've bought in a single week, or maybe even less than that. I'm doing quick math here, so maybe fact check me in the comments. But I mean, it's a very small percentage here of what they're building out. So I mean, at the end of the day, when you have 800,000 Bitcoin and Bitcoin goes up by a couple percentage points, they'll be making billions of dollars in single days just because of a few percentage points increase on on Bitcoin. So I think what he's doing is extremely smart. And to be honest, I don't think the market even knows. So I wouldn't give yourself too much of a hard time here, Robin, because I think this is just a very new product for everybody. And I think the interesting thing is a lot of Bitcoiners maybe had a sour taste in the market. I mean, I know I did. When we saw the GameStop boom in 2020, I was looking at all these things. I was a Bitcoin maxi for sure, but maybe not full fledged, just all in on Bitcoin at that time. And, you see GameStop run up, and I was like, what the hell? This market is extremely manipulated. We're seeing oil go crazy right now. We're seeing a bunch of AI stocks be extremely overvalued. And I think, when you look at how the mechanics of the market is working, I think that it just hasn't been priced in yet how much of a moat they have on this whole Bitcoin thing when it comes to putting it on the balance sheet. And it's still a relatively new process, right? Strategy's just been doing it for 6 years. They're launching a lot of these preferreds within the last 1 to 2 years, and it's new. And one thing that I've learned about Wall Street, the government, everything, when something is new, they need to cross their T's and dot their I's and make sure that they have their bases covered before they really start to go in. But once people start to figure this thing out, I mean, that's when we're off to the races, to say the very least.
Yeah, I just calculated quickly, like 32 Bitcoin is 0.03 per mil of the whole stack. So what is it? 0.000 or like 0.003 percent of the whole stack, which is like obviously nothing, considering they're buying tens of thousands of Bitcoin usually. But I think what this might also be is just testing the waters. Like, I think Saylor is just actively trying, hey, let's just sell 32 Bitcoin. Let's see how the market reacts. Let's see how the strategy common shares react, the stretch shares react, and how Bitcoin price reacts. I think he's just literally running an experiment at that week. With Microseed, you can engrave your 12 or 24 word seed phrase, the entire seed phrase, onto a 1-inch small washer. Yes, just one washer. All 24 words on that one washer. You can hide that thing everywhere. And even better, you don't need to buy a new kit every time you have to get a new wallet. You can make unlimited backups because Microseed is not selling the washer. Microseed is selling the device that stamps the washer. So you get the full kit with the device, with the washers, with the hammer, with everything you need to get started today. And you can make with that unlimited amount of backups. Go now to microseed.io. I finally and officially mine Bitcoin. This is not just something to stack more Satoshis, but it's most importantly also to support the network. Individual miners are the ones that keep the Bitcoin network decentralized. And by the way, you get KYC-free Bitcoin. That's why I use Simple Mining. I get an actual proper Bitcoin miner. They set it up for me. They repair it if it breaks down. And most importantly, they let me choose the pool and even connect my own full node. I'm completely sovereign and I'm completely in control. And I can sign up with Ocean, no account needed. I just give them a Bitcoin address and then there's mining going on. No KYC, nothing. So if you're ready to mine Bitcoin, go to simplemining.io, tell them you come from Robin, and let's mine Bitcoin together.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I wouldn't even doubt that. I mean, I think he's, very smart. He's kind of gone through the whole thing. He was a billionaire before Bitcoin, right? I mean, so that's pretty cool to say the very least, right? So, I mean, he knows what he's doing when it comes to running a company. Sure, right? I mean, there has been some bumps in the road, as there is. Every business owner, every billionaire has had some, ups and downs in their career. And I think, when you look at Saylor, he's just utilizing all the tools and really forward when it comes to tech thinking, really forward when coming into all of the different preferreds and everything. And he's tapping into these $1 trillion markets. I mean, the fixed income markets, I believe $145 trillion, right? So, I was mentioning earlier, if they just get 1 to 2%, Bitcoin's market cap's at like $1.5 trillion right now. And look, if they get that, that's doubling Bitcoin right there, just 1%. 2% of that, that's tripling Bitcoin. And that's just based on market cap. I mean, we also have, the theory, I believe it's like $8 or for every $1 into Bitcoin, it's like 8 that goes into Bitcoin's market cap. So, I mean, with this fixed supply asset, nobody really understands how to value it yet. And I mean, we're sitting at what, like $75,000, $73,000 now at this point. And I think, like I said earlier, everybody's just being lulled to sleep because, they're thinking, we're not going to see the classic 10x run ups and everything like that. But I mean, the whales have been selling off who have been in for a long time, basically giving Strategy their Bitcoin. And I think at this point, over time, more and more whole coiners are going to be taken off the market as Strategy keeps buying. And like you said earlier, right? If they're able to buy 10 Bitcoin and have to sell one, I mean, what, that's just semantics at that point, right? I mean, they're basically just buying 9 Bitcoin, and just funding the dividends over time. So I think, as long as Saylor said, right, he's going to buy more Bitcoin than he sells. I mean, he hasn't been one to really doubt in all of this market. I mean, we're seeing Strategy trade like it's in the Mag 7, the amount of volume that it's getting. And, Bitcoin is still a very young asset. So, I mean, as it keeps developing, it's going to be more and more people trying to be a copycat. And there's definitely going to be some failures throughout the way, right? I mean, when you have somebody trying to play the same game as somebody who has 800,000 Bitcoin and they maybe have 20,000 or maybe even less, it's going to be difficult to replicate something like Saylor's doing. So, I mean, he's going to be the top dog for a while, and I really don't see anybody really surpassing him unless he decides, all right, we're going to get to 1 million Bitcoin, and that's going to be it. I don't have any reason to believe that's really going to be the case, but you never know, right? I mean, things change over time. And the way he's going right now, 1 million Bitcoin is definitely in sight by the end of this year.
That's you think like 1 million Bitcoin on Strategy's balance sheet, not price. I was confused for a second because I have a hard time believing 1 million Bitcoin price this year.
Yeah, I mean, hey, if we get there, Robin, me and you will be both pleasantly surprised. But that means I don't have enough Bitcoin at this time, so I need to maybe buckle down, man, and get back to work right after this to start providing more value and get more Bitcoin on my personal balance sheet. Then.
You mentioned something in the beginning of the before we started recording on the podcast on me, which I did not know, and so I want to get it in the podcast also because people might also not know about it. You mentioned the 90-day stretch. The thing, now the stretch is like a different word, but the 90-day thing that we see with the Clarity Act. What is it, and why is it important for Bitcoiners?
Yeah, so the next 90-day stretch, I think, is not only important for Bitcoin. I think it's one of the most consequential points in Bitcoin's history right now. And of course, a lot of people are going to say, "Oh, every 90 days is really important for Bitcoin." But I think we've almost been accustomed to sell the news now lately. But this next 90-day stretch is going to be more than just one bullish or bearish news. So we just had the Clarity Act pass the Senate floor, which means basically it's just moving on to the next round. So in this next 90 days, there's going to be 2 more rounds that are going to need to be held up. And Senator Cynthia Lummis has said, if this Clarity Act doesn't get passed by August, September time, it won't get passed till 2030 because we're going to have the midterm elections in the United States later this year. And then, the next 2 years, everybody's going to be looking at the next presidential election. So I think we're going to see potentially 2 to 3 more things come out of the Clarity Act. And I think the Trump administration is a lot about symbolism. So I wouldn't be surprised if they really try to push to get this all passed by, America's 250th anniversary on July 4th. So that's coming in. And then we also, within that same week, we had Kevin Warsh, the new Fed chair, come in, who's been obviously like in Trump's corner. And everybody's assuming that he's just going to come in and cut rates to zero right away. I don't necessarily think that. He's been really, against all of this inflation. But something interesting that he said throughout this entire time was that he wants to shrink the Fed's balance sheet, that he really wants to, kind of move in and, shrink the Fed's balance sheet, but also cut interest rates. So he wants to do quantitative tightening with quantitative easing at the same exact time. So you're like, how the hell is this actually going to work? And his whole thing is that AI is going to boom productivity. And thus, AI is going to hold up for a lot of the, changes that we're going to see in just the overall dynamics of the market. And so within this next 90 days, not only do we have the Clarity Act needing to go through a few more stages, we have, the first Fed meeting of Kevin Warsh. So everybody's going to be looking at his tone, basically, right? I mean, before it was a meme, is Jerome Powell coming out with a purple or red or orange or whatever color tie he's doing? People are going to be doing the same exact thing with Kevin Warsh, but they're going to be diving into the transcripts to really understand where his head is at as far as lowering interest rate. But the wrinkle in all of this here, Robin, is that Jerome Powell hasn't left the Fed. He's just stepping down from the Fed chair, so to speak, right? His run there is over, but he still has votes in all of these FOMC meetings on whether or not they raise or lower interest rates all the way through January 2030. So he's still going to be here for the next 2.5 years. And he's been very adamant to try to keep his Volcker moment where he wants to keep interest rates very high. So there's going to be an interesting dynamic playing out where, Warsh has come in and said he wants a quote regime change with all of this. And he wants to move in to more of, cutting interest rates, keeping everything low, keeping money cheap. And there's going to be basically these two factors playing out, which I think is going to carry over into the institutional side of things. I mean, we've been talking about MSTR this whole time. And, one thing that they've been able to do is get money cheap. One thing that was evident in 2025 with a lot of these institutions coming on board and buying Bitcoin is that they were able to get money cheap. And when interest rates are lower, institutions are able to get that money. And then it makes sense to go buy Bitcoin. The one thing I think holding a lot of these institutions back is that the Clarity Act has, been around for, been tossed around for a little bit. And Bitcoin has been looked at as, as similar to gold in a sense, but it's not written in stone, so to speak. So say another, administration comes in and they're they're against Bitcoin. They could essentially just scratch that whole thing out and say, Bitcoin is, more of a security or something like that. And it's just more difficult. There's more regulations. Maybe another administration comes in and tries to do choke point 3.0. I mean, there's endless possibilities that comes in when you essentially cycle in a new administration every couple of years in the United States. So a lot of these businesses maybe have been like, all right, we're going to watch this institutional experiment play out for a couple years and, see how it really goes. And they've seen a lot of these institutions get hammered here recently with buying around 120, 100 plus thousand and seeing it dip a little bit. And they've been cautious and maybe they've been like, okay, the price action is one thing. But the other thing is like, we don't know how this is going to develop long term as far as like Bitcoin goes through regulations and everything like that. So the two factors I think I'm looking at are, all right, well, is Warsh going to really cut interest rates and are the administration going to basically write Bitcoin as in stone, setting it on the same playing field as gold? And if that's the case, then institutions who maybe been teetering on the side can now have easy access to capital and thus buy more Bitcoin. And we've been seeing basically Strategy being one of the few companies that have been buying Bitcoin. And that's basically what propped up the market in 2025. So I'll be looking for that in the next 90 days to really take off. And then that means, a bullish Q4, I think, to really say the least, if this all gets passed. And then companies really have to sit themselves down and look, see what Strategy is doing, maybe not being able to replicate it like we've lined out here earlier in this, but also saying, okay, it's better than having cash on our balance sheet. Maybe they actually start to buy Stretch on their balance sheet, right? And say, okay, what, Strategy is not going to get hammered. We can have a 10 to 13% dividend, and we're going to let the big dog, Michael Saylor, just start to play the Bitcoin game for us. And then, over time, that's just going to develop into, this institutional arm getting more solidified. And, as Bitcoiners, obviously, we don't need institutions to come in and buy Bitcoin, but I think it just adds that validity, like we've seen with the ETFs. Now people really have that, I guess, multiple touch points before they actually, maybe pull the trigger and buy Bitcoin. And I think eventually everybody's going to see all these companies buying Bitcoin, all of these, governments here down the line, and they're going to start to really look at it. And then it's going to turn into what we've seen with gold, with a lot of these central banks not wanting to buy the ETFs, a lot of these individuals wanting to hold physical gold. And then I think we'll see an outpour of the ETFs. But it's all starting here in these next 90 days, because if not, then I think that timeline will be delayed for at least another, 3 to 4 years.
I think it's so interesting what's going on in Bitcoin. I think we could. Are you bullish on 2026? Like, are you? Because I'm kind of excited for the end of 2026.
Yeah, I mean, I think, like Bitcoin's in this interesting spot where everybody thinks the bull market's over. We've had, if you just look at the math, right, institutions are buying 450 Bitcoin or more a week, right? So, I mean, are the sellers going to get exhausted? I think we've seen a lot of the Bitcoin miners move into AI. I think just over time, right? I mean, as long as there's not a bunch of paper Bitcoin sitting on the market, a lot of these people are going to start waking up to the fact. And like I said, I think that towards the end of this year, I'm pretty confident the Clarity Act's going to get passed. The only thing holding it up is like this stablecoin yield type of argument that Jamie Dimon and Brian Armstrong are yelling at each other about. And at the end of the day, Bitcoin doesn't care about any of that. If Bitcoin comes in and is, able to, whether that part gets axed or is in or whatever, I think really doesn't matter for the Bitcoin side of things. So I think all of that is just, more nuanced. And I think, when you look at how this is all going to get passed, Brian Armstrong just really wants to pad his own bags and, get all of those dividends coming in from Circle buying the US treasuries and everything like that. And maybe we can get into the mechanics of what Coinbase is doing here too, if you want. But I think at the end of the day, I'm extremely bullish on Bitcoin, especially when it comes to later in this year, which at this point, I'm baking in that the Clarity Act gets passed. And I mean, it's not just me saying this either. Citibank, one of the largest banks who's just getting into Bitcoin, has said that if the Clarity Act's passed, their end of year target is 145,000, I believe, which is double the Bitcoin price right now. So, and that's an institution who's been in the game for a while. So I think that being said, right? It's not just these bullish YouTubers coming in and yelling at you, hey, Bitcoin's going to go up by the end of the year. It's some of the biggest institutions in the world now saying this.
Yeah, it's we sometimes get like, oh, you just say that because you want Bitcoin to go up. No, we are saying that because we think Bitcoin is going up. Like that's a very important like nuance there. It's like we didn't just like buy Bitcoin, then talk about it to pump it, because like I don't know, like have you heard that once in a while, or like you want to just pump your bags? I'm like, how influential do you think I am that I can pump the Bitcoin price? Like
Yeah,
I'm
I
not
mean,
that
let's
big of a
face it.
deal.
Yeah, let's face it, Robin. I mean, like you and I, like, I mean, you have a great show here. I mean, I create content and all this, but how much is our pool realistically? I mean, a lot of the market was being driven by institutions. And, if institutions listen to my show or listen to your show, that's great. But I don't think at the end of the day, people are really, billion-dollar hedge funds plus are like listening to us and saying, okay, you know what? Just because Brandon at Green Candle said that Bitcoin's going to go to $1 million a coin in the next five years, I'm going to go all in on it right now. I think that they've got to do a lot more due diligence and everything like that. I've tried to encourage some of my friends, and I don't have enough influence to even get a lot of my family members into Bitcoin. So, I mean, I'm just blowing hot air into a microphone. And if people want to say, okay, I'm trying to pump my own bags, I'm glad you think I have that much influence. And like Robin here, I'm glad you guys think that we have that much influence. But at the end of the day, it's a $1.5 trillion asset. If you go in, even if you buy 10 Bitcoin, that's not really going to move the market, right? I mean, Michael Saylor sold 32 Bitcoin. If you have enough capital right now watching this to buy 32 Bitcoin, God bless you, because, I would say go for it. But I mean, that at the end of the day isn't going to move the market either. So I think the amount of capital that needs to go into Bitcoin on a daily, weekly, monthly basis is just simply like we just don't have that much influence just yet. Just yet, though, Robin. Just yet. Maybe we will in the future. But even then, too, right? I mean, hopefully during that time, Bitcoin's like a $10 trillion asset, and if we have that influence, it's not going to really skyrocket it right off the bat, right?
I also think so. Really fun conversation, I guess so. Really cool. One thing I want to get also your take on is, what do you think is the most interesting things Bitcoin are doing that has nothing to do with Bitcoin at all? I heard that thing recently, and I was like, that's a fascinating question. Because you talk with a lot of Bitcoiners, you do a lot in Bitcoin. What's that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think, like, just the development of these circular economies to help out, spending Bitcoin in various places. I think what Cash App has done has been, one of the most heralded stories of 2026. I mean, they essentially just are like one of the biggest merchants in the United States that just opened up the floodgates to allow people to pay in Bitcoin. I mean, I was in Austin, Texas not too long ago, and I went and played paddle, where I rented the paddle, boards for $20 US, but I was able to pay in Bitcoin because they had a Square terminal there. So I think that's very interesting. I think a lot of businesses, I mean, at the end of the day, I think if you're a small business owner, it just gives you more tailwind as well to grow a business. I mean, my dad is a small business owner, so I'm very passionate about people growing that, and I think that's the true blood of the economy, just globally, right? I mean, it helps with the decentralization. It lets us to allow to have great products and services, and not just get swallowed up by these big guys. So, what I'm most bullish on is not only people spending Bitcoin, but the small carpenters, air conditioned people, all of these people who are now accepting Bitcoin or accepting cash and putting a little bit of Bitcoin on their balance sheet, even at a small level, I think will just make society as a whole 10 times better down the line. And I think, when it comes down to that, that makes me extremely bullish on what's going forward, because now we have a lot of, I guess, good headed entrepreneurs in the market. And, it allows you to make different decisions, make a little bit more risks, and really try to pursue something that maybe might not be the most fruitful initially, or take some risks, live life in a better light, go travel. I mean, without Bitcoin, I wouldn't have been able to do what I'm doing right now, just simply because it's very difficult to fly to all these places and everything like that. So Bitcoin truly changed my life just by putting it on my own personal balance sheet over time. And I'm extremely bullish watching others do the same. So I think, not only creating these circular economies to get ready for, what I see as these next 20 to 30 years of really becoming, the medium of exchange, and changing from that digital gold narrative and moving it into more of that, the peer-to-peer electronic cash that Bitcoin was truly created to be. I think just right now, right? I mean, we're seeing a lot of interesting things with companies, and Saylor obviously is at the forefront of all of that.
Yeah, really cool. Thank you so much, Brandon. Was a fun one, and I'm just looking at like strategy. I'm looking at all the things that are going on in the world with strategy, with Strive, with Bitcoin, with the Clarity Act in Europe. You're currently in Europe, so I'm I'm really looking forward to what's being possible in Bitcoin in the next couple of weeks, months, and years ahead. It will be amazing. Don't over leverage, guys. Don't do crazy shit with your Bitcoin, and you will most likely be very, very, very fine. I would say.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I mean, what's going on in Europe too is pretty interesting. I mean, we're seeing, the EU, the ECB, it's kind of come out against Bitcoin, but a lot of these banks now, a lot of large banks are starting to say, hey, you know what? I think it was like 37 banks have all joined together forces to try to create a euro stablecoin, because they're looking at, trying to get away from the potential of a central bank digital currency here in the EU. And a lot of these banks here are also putting Bitcoin on their balance sheets. So I think, like, all over the world, you're seeing just extremely bullish signals. So I don't know how you can't be bullish towards the end of this year, Robin. I mean, I think we're going to start to see, Bitcoin's price start to reflect that. We're just having a little bump in the road, as Bitcoin loves to give us, right?
It humbles us. Bitcoin always humbles us, and that's a good thing, I think, for the whole sector, for you and me, and for everyone involved. We have an end routine in the podcast, as you might know from previous experiences, where the previous guest is asking a question for the next guest without knowing who the next guest actually is. And the previous guest asked you the question: what do you hope Bitcoin does to your life in the next 5 years?
Yeah, I mean, I hope Bitcoin, what it does to my life is it gives me the ability to create big companies, travel the world, continue to do that, and start a family. I'm a little early on in that. I don't have any chicas. Maybe you got a big feminine audience out here, women watching Robin. So ladies, holler at me, I guess. But I think that's how I want to develop it all. Is just it's given me the ability to really like travel the world, see places, meet cool people like yourself, have great experiences already. So I would love to continue to do that in the next 5 years, and build some cool companies as well, and really help founders and others, kind of do the same. So I think that's the big mission I'm on, is help good people, good entrepreneurs really start to grow their business and and continue doing what I'm doing, help marketing, all that kind of stuff. So that's what I would hope. And yeah, I think I'm extremely bullish going forward here in 26. And in the next 5 years, man, who knows? Maybe, hopefully, the back isn't wearing out on me, and I'm not an old hag at that point, man. Hopefully, I'm still getting some sun, looking tan, and having a good life.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Brandon, for being on the podcast. Before I let you go, where can people find you, ask you questions, and reach out to you?
Yeah, you can find me at Keys Open Doors, Keys Open _ doors on all social media platforms, and then Green Candle on YouTube and Green Candle on to follow the media companies.
Really cool. Thank you so much, Brandon, for being on. And also thank you so much for everyone that is watching and listening, for joining us today. As always, I'll be back. This content is for educational and entertainment purposes only and does not constitute financial advice.